Hello, and today we're going to be looking at a scenario where Italy is a great power before World War One. How this happens, I'm not quite sure, but there are a few key moments. Firstly, they do much better in the Prusso-Austrian War. They take all of southern Tyrol and many other regions along Dalmatia. They also at some point managed to take Albania, possibly from the Ottomans, and in the scramble for Africa, they gained Tunisia and Ethiopia. Perhaps most importantly, they also managed to gain all of Savoy and Nice, along with Corsica from France. Maybe they retake it during the Franco-Prussian War, or maybe they just never give it to France in the first place. Which one of the two doesn't matter much. Let's just get straight into what may have changed. Now, obviously, depending on the timeline here, a lot would have changed. The Balkans would have been completely different. Austria could have been very different. Hungary could have had even more powerful in the nation. Had even more power in the nation. And as for Serbia, they could have gone either way. Either doing way better against the Austrians, who barely have a coastline anymore, or struggling more against the Ottomans as their rivalry with the Italians stunts their growth completely. Despite all these changes which would have happened, we're just going to ignore that and assume the only thing that's changed before World War I here is that Italy is much stronger. I have even given them Ticino. We'll just assumed it rebelled from Switzerland during the Italian Revolutionary Wars, unifying themselves, and wanted to join up with the new Italian state instead of Switzerland. This, along with the four more mentioned expansions, turns Italy into maybe not a great power, but definitely a major power of the era. It's easily above Austria-Hungary, and with an industry finally stronger than even small nations like Belgium. They still can't rival the great powers of Germany and the UK, but they are for sure way, way stronger. Despite all these new lands they've taken, though, there is a major drawback. They lack allies. The Germans may very well still team up with the Austrians, and as the Franco-Russian-British alliance forms up, both sides hate the Italians. At some point, very recently, Italy went to war with both Austria and France to retake their territories. So neither would really be wanting to be their friend. Despite them having all of these new lands, they simply don't have a strong natural friendship like the Franco-Russian alliance. We're gonna see what happens there, as World War I will soon be breaking out with Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Once again, we're gonna assume that nothing changed here for whatever reason, and that Franz Ferdinand is still assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, and the Great War starts. For the most part, I'm going to be ignoring colonies. We all know what would happen there. Germany would not win. Swiftly, the Russians would join the war. The French would join the war. Once again, assuming for whatever reason nothing else changed outside Italy, the war has no reason of starting up differently. It's possible some sort of Italo-Ottoman war could have started it, some type of Italo-Serbian war, even an Italo-Austrian war could have started it. But nope, we're just going to assume Italy is still deciding what to do. Do they want to take even more lands from France, which they really have no claim on? Or do they want to take more lands from Austria, where their only remaining claim is really along the Dalmatian coast? Let's start mapping some of it out. Firstly, the Italian invasion into Serbia. A complete disaster. They would barely take any land. In fact, they would do worse than in our timeline. The Hungarians hold them back even more, as Austria has lost very important territories, especially here along the coast in Trieste. That is truly devastating. They have practically no navy left, and their country as a whole is far more unstable. Meanwhile, this would allow the Russians to do even better. If you didn't know, in our timeline, they had a successful invasion into Galicia. Here, that would be even stronger, even better, which would force Germany to send even more troops to help the Austrians out. The 1/3 of the Austrian army that was lost here in our timeline could be up to half. They would have to completely restructure, and that would be a major loss. Aside from Austro-Hungarian losses, the war would start off similarly. The UK would join, as Germany decides to invade through Belgium. This technically would see German victories. They may push ever so slightly less into Belgium, maybe not even reaching as much of the coast. Belgium would for sure still exist. And much of northern France would be left unaffected, as I mentioned earlier, a lot more German troops would have to be sent over to the Eastern Front to help out the struggling Austro-Hungarians. Still, the start of the war really wouldn't be all that different, despite slightly better Entente position. From here, we're going to skip forward a few years. Eventually, Romania, Bulgaria, the Ottomans, they all join in. Everything is going pretty much how it did historically. And Italy may even join later. They are in a much better position, and they really have no direct need to join the war. In fact, they have no more land claims at all, so they would be joining purely for economic reasons, and if you didn't know, war isn't great for a person's economy, so they will stay out of it for quite a while. Still, they would have more claims on the Austrians than on the French, and although Italian-French relations would be strained over Nice and Savoy, and probably Tunisia and especially Corsica as well, in fact, all these lands that Italy took from France would be a major dent in their relationship. I still think that eventually Italy would join up with the Entente. This would just start completely collapsing the Central Powers. In our timeline, Italy joining was a minor distraction. The Austro-Hungarians were able to hold a very defensible front in southern Tyrol and in Trieste. Here, there's a much longer front line, and since we assumed that the Italian government was much more competent in past wars, we're going to have to assume that they are also much more competent here. Given this, the Italians will immediately see significant progress into Austrian lands, probably connecting up with Fiume and capturing most of what's left of the Austro-Hungarian coast. They may also attempt a slight northern invasion, but this would fail due to the mountainous terrain. They would also slowly start sorting out their issues with the French, as neither side would really like each other, but the French need the Italians. If the Italians were to join the Central Powers, that could completely end the war for the Entente. Meanwhile, the Italian entry would also be helping out in Serbia and in Montenegro, as Italian troops in Albania would be doing a lot. Meanwhile, the intervention of Greece, after an even shorter civil war due to Italian aid, would allow a complete collapse of the Central Power Balkan front line. And we can assume that soon enough, the US would be getting involved as well. Firstly, the Germans would be desperate. They would be doing absolutely everything they can on the Eastern Front to deal damage to the Russians, but it just wouldn't be enough. With Italian aid, especially from the Dodecanese Islands, a new naval invasion of the Ottomans may be possible, or even a second Gallipoli, which I do consider unlikely. Either way, the Ottomans are collapsing far, far earlier. Since they lost the Italo-Ottoman War by even more, they were already in a worse position. And we can assume that Italy would simply continue these wins along the Dalmatian coast. Germany has no troops. They are sending everything they have over to the Eastern Front to fight in Russia. They simply cannot help the Austro-Hungarians down in Dalmatia. So the Italians would see victory after victory, reclaiming most of Montenegro and taking the entire Adriatic coastline. From here, the Americans join, and Russia is still alive. Due to this distraction and the Austro-Hungarian weakness, we're going to assume that Russia is able to survive and is even able to pull off some minor counteroffensives. The Ottomans are collapsing, and assuming that the Ottomans surrender far earlier than in our timeline due to their previous loss to Italy, and now far more pressure being put on their southern coast from the Italian Dodecanese Islands. Now plenty of supplies, military and especially civilian, can come into Russia through the Bosphorus. From here, Bulgaria would also swiftly surrender, as, they really don't stand much of a chance here against a stronger Greece and, a stronger Italy and a fully alive Greece, which would leave just the Austro-Hungarians, who are in a horrible position. The Italians are now making extremely swift progress into Bosnia and reclaiming a majority of Serbia. I don't know why Bulgaria's blue there. They would even be starting to push back into Romania. Meanwhile, over on the Western Front, American troops would start to arrive and would be pushing back the Germans significantly. This easily about half a year sooner the Entente is doing far, far better. And we can assume that sooner or later, probably about 6 months earlier than in our timeline, the Entente may come out on top, as this Italian strength really, although it didn't affect Germany so much, it completely destroyed the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, which allowed Russia to survive, which just snowballed into a much, much easier Entente win. Now let's take a look at the peace treaty here. As for Italy itself, it would of course seize all of the Dalmatian coastline. I see no world in which they don't do this. This is really their only remaining major land claim against the Austrians or against any of their neighbors. All Italian speakers are already in Italy. Their colonial empire is extremely strong. They really have nothing else to demand. Meanwhile, the Italian economy would also be thriving, as they wouldn't have to spend nearly as many resources, and once again, it's not really part of their territorial expansion, but we're assuming that the Italian government is far more constitutional, far less, far more meritocratic, and just less autocratic, which would help them out significantly, not just in military, but in economy as well. Them also owning most of the Adriatic would also help significantly. As for the rest of the peace treaty, Bosnia and whatever's left of Croatia would still likely go to Serbia, who may not even form Yugoslavia here. It's actually, you know what? Yeah, let's do that. I think you can tell I'm kind of making this up as I go, but we're going to have an independent Croat state under probably some sort of Italian monarch or just under an Italian-influenced government. Serbia would still expand northward, but this new Italian state would serve as a buffer between the two. Meanwhile, Montenegro would stay independent and would likely be under great Italian influence, as it was Italian troops that reclaimed their country during the war. Due to this lacking Serbian expansion into Austria, they may even gain more lands into Bulgaria. Now, don't expect a complete Serbian annexation of Bulgaria, but a few extra lands in Macedonia or in the north may be possible to compensate them. Over in Bulgaria, they would see a very similar peace treaty. The Greeks would take the south. However, with the better Greek position, they may even take further territories, simply because they can. And now they have no way of going into Albania or anything like that. So expansion into Bulgaria makes even more sense. If we look up at Romania, they would actually have a worse peace treaty than in our timeline, as since Russia never collapsed, they never managed to take Moldova. They would still obviously gain Transylvania, but that actually means that Romania grew less than in our timeline, despite the Entente doing better, and them being a part of the Entente. Meanwhile, of course, we have to look at Russia. Probably one of the biggest winners here. Actually, I made that horribly. That is not what Transylvania looks like. Let's do the Russian borders first, as they would take all of Galicia. All of the Polish and Ukrainian speakers in the area would now be Russian. And in fact, Romania, having never collapsed, and generally the war being shorter, would mean a much lighter peace treaty, so I am only going to give them southern Transylvania, leaving a stronger Hungary. We can also assume that due to the Italian strength, ignore that, a real-world proposal was that Hungary would rebel against Austria and even declare their own independence together with the Italians. Here, with a stronger Italy with more influence on the Entente, they could be convinced to go for this, leading to a much, much larger Hungary after the war. This means they keep many more lands in their south. Basically, all or at least most Hungarian speakers would stay inside of Hungary. Now, this new state could go either way. I could see it being Russian-aligned or Italian-aligned, but since this is a video about Italy, we are going to be making them Italian-aligned, further increasing their sphere of influence. Meanwhile, down in the south, we would have Austria, which would now be heavily under Italian influence, as they're right on the border, and Italy would basically take over the Austrian government, put it under their own control. In the west, we would see a similar peace treaty to in real life. The French will, of course, take Alsace-Lorraine. The Belgians take that tiny little piece of land I can never remember the name of, and the Luxembourgish gain nothing. Now, of course, they do gain some minor occupations on the Rhine, and it's, oh wow, that Alsace looks terrible. And the Germans would still have major war operations, but due to the shorter war and probably more Italian influence, they may even be settled with less war operations than in our timeline. Looking down at the Ottomans, we would see major Italian wins. In real life, they were promised the southern Anatolian coast, but due to the Turkish Revolution under Kemal Ataturk, they never got these lands that were promised to them. This would change a lot, not just for Italy, as victory in this war due to Italian entrance and due to the war being shorter, and Russian entry, really, Ataturk doesn't stand a chance here, and Turkey would be totally carved up. Armenia would go to the Russians, Italy would gain control, first Greece would take control over much of the coast, some of it with Greek speakers, some not so much. The Italians would take the southern coastline, possibly even more than in our timeline, and they would likely gain a sphere of influence going up into Anatolia as well, although I'm not going to graph that here. Meanwhile, the Russians, of course, their most important land grab would be Constantinople, or Istanbul. This is what they wanted most out of this war, and even though the British would try and deny it to them, trying to make it international, British occupied, even Greek, it simply would not go through. The Russians would get it. Down in the south, we would see something probably similar to what we got in our timeline, French Syria, the rest being British, really. Maybe an independent Hejaz, but I see no real reason for this peace treaty to be different, except for the fact that, actually, yeah, the French would gain more than just Syria. As the Turks lose their independence war, both French Syria and British Iraq would be much stronger. This would just serve as even more land expansions for the Allies, and a heavily weakened and very, very angry little Turkey. Although I'm not sure how much of a difference this would make, especially if they did try and go to war with all of the rest of the powers and lost. Major war operations, military restrictions, they would essentially become a puppet of the Entente, most especially of Italy. So this is all that's left of the Ottomans now, all that's left of Bulgaria now. Let's finish up the Austro-Hungarian peace treaty. The Russians, of course, take all of Galicia with their Polish and Ukrainian speakers. The Romanians get their little land expansion, but not nearly as much as they wanted, meaning Romanian-Hungarian tensions may be greatened, which basically means that Romanian-Italian tensions would be heightened as well. Czechia would likely also be placed under Italian influence. Without making Czechoslovakia, it would be another toss-up between Italy and Russia being the one to influence it. I'm going to give it to Italy. I could see it going either way. Being a shorter war, it's even less likely that nations like Denmark get their land. They didn't even join the war. I don't want to give them any land. Meanwhile, the Russians would gain Posen from the Germans, and most probably Memel as well, but they would not seize the Polish Strip or any other lands in Zaolzie, etc. There's really no reason to. The British are already mad that they took Istanbul, so they do not want to give them any more land than they want to. The British may even want a stronger Germany to combat Italy and Russia going into the future. This is the end of the peace treaty here, except for Africa. Guess what happens in Africa? Basically the exact same thing as in our timeline. The Italians in real life did have some very, very minor plans to take Cameroon for themselves, but realistically, that's just not happening. One thing that is quite possible is that with the Italians doing more, and them maybe not getting as much initially, they would be granted more land concessions from the British much earlier, such as in Somalia, or even in the Sahara, as Libya could very well be expanded southward. Something like that. Now, these borders aren't beautiful, but it's Europeans strong in Africa, so I don't see why these borders would be beautiful. There we go. The Italians got some extra desert and a bit of not so deserty desert, but still pretty useless land. Either way, I didn't mention it probably as much as I should have, but Italian control over Tunisia would be very important, as they could now block off the Mediterranean, and this would just overall increase their strength even more. Let's go ahead and make everything white and take a look at the Italian Empire we have created here. They have grown across Dalmatia, across the Adriatic, and in Africa, where they now have a substantial colonial empire. They may even be able to push their influence in areas like East Asia and China in the Pacific, but of course their main influence would still be in Europe, where Austria, Czechia, and Croatia would all be directly under their influence, while nations like Hungary and Montenegro would be heavily reliant on them. And it's possible that with the annexation of Ticino, Switzerland would also be put under Austrian guidance. We also have to talk about Italian interests in southern Turkey, and probably in other areas around the world as well. We have truly given the Italians an empire to be proud of, although it has changed a lot of Italian politics in the process, seeing as the king may even be under constitutional monarchy here, as we do want a stronger Italian government, although I'm not going to go into depth on that. Benito Mussolini will never rise to power. The Italians have a strong economy. They've taken all the lands they could possibly want. There's simply no way for him to take power. Rome is simply not an idea here, but we have established a greater Italy under a constitutional monarchy with great influence in the Balkans, and sadly, a possible future war. I see them being at odds with Serbia and Romania as inevitable. A Serbian-Romanian-Greek alliance against the Italians is very possible, although the Italians will get help from states like Bulgaria, and if they're willing to give up their southern Turkish lands, Turkey could also be a very valuable ally to them. As for future world wars, Germany will very likely ally with the British, while the Italians are kind of doing their own thing, and the Franco-Russian alliance could even live on, as the French are kind of mad at the British for allowing this to take place, and because they did not gain as much as they wanted. In fact, France is slightly worse off here than in our timeline. Colonially, they've lost Djibouti and Tunisia, hurting them significantly, and of course their lands in southern Europe. With that, I think I'm going to end it here. We've given the Italians a state to be proud of. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.